Welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, The Roadmap for Securing HIPAA-Related Content and Eliminating Compliance Gaps. I'm Shay Mann and I will be your moderator. Today's webinar is in listen-only mode. If you have any questions throughout the event, go ahead and submit those in the Q&A panel and we will answer them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. This session will be recorded and we will email you a link to the recorded version tomorrow. Joining us today is Mike Sheeran, a SailPoint technical specialist with a deep understanding of what it takes to secure and manage access to data files. Having worked in the data security industry for much of his career, Mike has increasingly supported healthcare providers, particularly in recent years. Mike graduated with a degree in Management and Information Systems from Kent State University and currently resides in Atlanta, Georgia. Also joining us today is Sharon Farber, a product line manager at SailPoint. She's responsible for the Security IQ product line, an identity governance solution that extends to data files. Sharon has been in the IGA field from the early days. Her experience includes consulting and implementing IGA solutions for many organizations around the globe. Sharon has a computer science degree and an MSc in business and statistics. And with that, Mike's going to kick us off with discussing the current landscape of the healthcare industry, the current threats that are out there, and the gaps that organizations are faced with. Then Sharon will take it away to talk about how to develop a blueprint to address those gaps. Mike, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Shay. Good afternoon, everyone. So the threat landscape has changed significantly. No healthcare organization is safe from attacks. Almost daily, we're bombarded with more news of data breaches. In 2017, we've already had over 200 reported data breaches in the healthcare industry alone. That accounts for almost a quarter of all data breaches. And the threat environment is not only increasing daily, it's also shifted the focus from the human factor, the weakest link as we know it out there today. Why? Because identity is the key to accessing sensitive data. Today, it's quicker to fool a person than it is to penetrate a network. But yet, how we approach security hasn't changed. We continue to rely on these traditional methods without accepting that network security can't fully protect our applications and our data. How did we get to this point? Those threat conditions that are out there today. Well, if you look at the industry historically, we see that efforts to lower costs and improve outcomes have led to the digitization of data in order to allow for data sharing. But there's challenges associated with sharing this information and this data, particularly around making sure that the right person has the right access at the right time. Back in the day, very recently and even today, record sharing was as simple as walking up to a file cabinet and grabbing a manila folder. And look how Justin Bieber had his medical exam put out there in the news. Over time, security around these files, these physical files, has tightened up. Although the mindset of gathering and sharing information to do one's job really hasn't changed. People need the access to be able to perform their job wherever that data lies. The digital age arrives and industry growth and success has grown exponentially. The modernization of data and records management has come with many challenges. Some of these challenges include multiple authoritative sources for users' identities. You have a diverse user population, they have multiple roles or personas per their identity. We often find with providers that there's a disparity between processes, systems, and even identity administration, plus with limited visibility and data breach detection. Now you couple that with extenuating factors such as data can be monetized on the black market and that the healthcare industry has been less sophisticated in warding off attackers, and you have an environment that's vulnerable for data breach. So the attacker, whether that attacker is outsider, an insider, or it could be a combination of the two, have many reasons to want to access an organization's data. That target data is not just health records. While it's the most valuable in the black market these days, employee records, credit card numbers, and critical financial data are also highly sought after. It's one thing to understand where this data resides. It's another thing to understand how it can be exposed. So let's look at some common occurrences that are out there today that we're seeing in the healthcare industry. Simple copying and pasting. A clinician could be conducting a research study that may copy or paste medication administration or flowchart information from an EHR solution into an application such as a Word document, a PowerPoint, or Excel for tracking. And some of those reasons just might be as simple as it's convenient for that individual to do their research or for a publication. Or maybe it's just an easier side-by-side comparison that they're seeing out there. Another example out there, maybe an assistant copied and pastes historical data from a day's scheduled visits into a Word document for a provider's consumption outside of the EHR solution. This occurs because that user is uncomfortable with using that EHR solution and wants a friendly reference or a friendly application to be able to deliver this information. That user also could prefer to work on this data outside of the time when they have access to the EHR solution. So it's not essentially convenient for them. A nurse in an acute care setting may copy and paste clinical data from an EHR to share with the primary care physician via email. And some of these reasons may be things like ambulatory or inpatient EHRs that are not integrated or interoperable, or simply it's just human nature, regardless of interoperability. Now, when we look at creating reports, organizations focus on getting that real-time reporting and analysis from their EHR solution. Unfortunately, a lot of times it's saved locally. At Epic organizations, these reports are called RWBs, Reporting Workbenches reports. One example is a provider's organization's Health Information Management Department may run a real-time operational report for auditing purposes. That report may later be saved to a network drive for future reference. Overnight EHR batch reports may run and be distributed on a network drive or a SharePoint site. Other non-EHR reporting might include multiple systems that quote-unquote talk to each other via exports. These reports often get placed on network drives and picked up programmatically. Another case is storing scanned documents. Many organizations still have a large amount of paper forms out there that must be scanned and linked to the EHR. Once scanned, documents can be exposed any number of ways, an export to a PDF file, to an email, for a variety of reasons. These systems, such as ECMs or DMSs, document management systems, also run reports that can be distributed via methods described previously here. ECMs may also store not only patient records, but can be shared throughout the organization, whether it be with human resources, the finance department, the legal department, what have you. Those are just some examples of how data can move throughout an organization and end up in locations where security isn't as tight as it originally or intended location. Common locations where this data turns up can easily be exposed. Some of these locations include network file shares, departmental drives, SharePoint sites, cloud drives. These are all places where unintended risk can easily and commonly occur. Unfortunately, there's limited options to understand how to uncover this risk, prioritize it, control it, and remediate it effectively. So there's some steps that we're going to go over here regarding overcoming the overwhelming, that analysis by paralysis. And to understand that, you have to understand how the data is getting there and how to focus on it. So when information migrates from a database, where it ultimately lands can be anywhere. And the volume of that data is absolutely massive. So here we have a large blue circle representing all of the data files in the provider organization. While most providers are put off by the size of the problem and give up even before beginning, SailPoint can help you simplify this daunting task and make it much more manageable, so we're able to pinpoint where you need to apply your efforts. So let's break down this data. There's 3 key data categories that are out there, and then there's 3 engines that are running. Those categories include sensitive data, stale data, and the access around that. Those 3 engines that are running are doing data classification analysis, we're monitoring activity, and we're doing permissions analysis to see where there could be open access. Now, if we want to look in the risk areas, you see A, B, and C right here. The 3 risk areas are sensitive data that is stale, and sensitive data that's exposed and stale. The worst is when you have open data that is sensitive. The second is when you have open sensitive data that is stale. And the third is when you just have sensitive data that is stale. Now, in doing so, you need to be able to have some calls to action. It's great to understand this, but now we have to know how to combat this. In doing so, we help you keep an eye on the big circle and continuously highlight the relatively small areas where you need to do things like establish ownership. Who owns this data? Let's put them accountable for it. Let's do an access review. Let's clean up and refactor AD security groups. Now, some key steps to overcome this, I'm going to map out here. There's about 9 of them. But where we want to start is first understanding what data is being used by mortals. How do they have access, and how are the paths they are using to get that access? Second, we need to focus on that low-hanging fruit. A vast majority of companies struggle with group nesting, where global groups are applied to locations where sensitive data is residing. Now that you know where sensitive data sits, you can establish security policies and real-time alerts around this data. You need to address misplaced sensitive information, tackling sensitive data that's outside of your current security controls, both now and ongoing. You need to understand the effective access that's out there. Those entitlements and access potential should be reviewed periodically, not only for HIPAA compliance, but for regular risk hygiene. You need to set forth a streamlined access process that allows your organization to feel confident in knowing that when you add a user to an AD group, that they're getting the proper rights to the right data at the right time to be able to do their job. And then as data is growing, we're seeing, and every organization sees this, data is not getting smaller, it's growing at an extremely rapid rate, and there's multiple business groups that are sharing data all the time. Establishing a data owner is critical to holding the business accountable for their data. These data owners need the means and tools to be able to strategically manage these critical data assets. Now, if the business is leaving sensitive data out there to sit with no controls, they're setting themselves up for a Sony-like breach experience, where old sensitive files are subject to risky storage policies. Also, we're in a day and age where people just need access to do their job. Many individuals might have 4 or 5 paths to get to data. Which ones are they actually using? Which one do they actually need? And how can we reduce that permissions creep? All common themes in organizations today. Having a comprehensive identity, governance, and administration solution brings key areas that I've mentioned before together to understand risk areas, like establishing control, putting a security measure in place to have a comprehensive solution to combat the vast array of organizational data security risk, and putting the onus not on IT, but on the business to have accountability over the data that they use and the data that they're responsible for. They need to understand what critical business and regulatory data they have in their purview and leverage as many IT security assets by building policy alerts with external solutions to take the necessary action where appropriate when our security policies are broken. So these 9 steps that I outlined here are absolutely critical, but how do you execute on these 9 steps? So as we move forward here, Sharon Farber, who's our product line manager, is going to take us through that execution of these steps.
Thanks, Mike. And let me start by discussing the identity context of the execution. As you invest into data security solution in your organization, consider looking at the identity aspect and add the identity context to your already invested technology. When you add the identity context, it really helps you understand that activity and who's the user behind the activity. Should he have access to begin with? Who is that person's manager? And that can also be involved in the overall government processes. Maybe you want to start an approval process based on the user background information, what department he works in, what time of day is that considered for that particular user. All that context from knowing the identity and knowing that additional information on the user can help you make decisions in real time. It can also help you strengthen the overall security in the organization and just harden your security posture. That also explains this prediction by Gartner earlier this year, saying basically that organizations combining identity governance with data access governance capabilities will experience fewer data breaches as they move into the next few years. What does it mean, comprehensive identity governance? As you deploy identity governance to your systems and application, which defines who can access which application and to what level of access are they granted permissions, in most organizations, access to data files and folders is being handled by a different group. At the end of the day, it's really the user, the identity that is behind that requires both systems and data access. So by combining the two, you are employing an integrated identity governance policy. You are applying all the governance processes, whether these are access requests, access certification, provisioning, user risk modeling, and many more. And the benefits are obvious. By centralizing all the access to application and data and using one policy across the organization, you gain better visibility to what the person has access to, and you minimize the overhead of handling and managing multiple processes at once. Another way to look at integrated identity governance is by reviewing different capabilities of an identity governance solution, providing access requests, entitlement cataloging, certification, role engineering, and many more. And on the other hand, look at the capabilities or the requirements of a data governance solution, which is more focused on data, classification of data, sensitive data, discovery, ownership, as Mike mentioned, events and monitoring, and so forth. And when you combine these two, you have the ability to answer very specific questions of why a particular person gained the access to a particular file or folder. You really can answer more granular questions on who has access to what, and that is important. Next, let's describe a four-point approach for why organizations are looking to protect sensitive data with identity governance. The first point here is visibility. It's about understanding the who, the what, and the where is sensitive data in the organization. The second area is establishing business accountability by applying data stewardship and ownership. The third area is compliance, providing an automated way to show compliance when the auditors are coming and not having to start from scratch each time. And finally, when it comes to remediation, how can we provide the intelligence in an actionable manner so it's easy to take action to remediate access that is shouldn't be given? So let's start and drill in on each one of these to understand better the needs and the capabilities. Starting with visibility, we're looking to locate sensitive data, and very specifically today we're talking about HIPAA-related data, whether it's PII or PHI type of data. We want to find where it resides in the organization. We may think it's on one particular file server on-premise, and yet we find a lot of that information over time moved to a cloud storage. Once we look at the sensitive data that was located, we start understanding and identifying who has access to those sensitive data sets. Should they have access to begin with? A lot of these access is granted either direct or much of it is granted indirectly, which means through group memberships. As you nest group into group, you end up with big groups that may not should not have access to begin with. By eliminating those group nesting in the organization and doing some cleanup can eliminate a lot of these exposure. And finally, as you remove and you start doing your cleanup, you can also start looking at what people are doing with their access to sensitive data by activity monitoring in real time and providing remediation action. So when we look at data classification technologies, in most cases we're looking at the content. We're looking into files, office files, and we look for content that relates, in our case, to PHI and PII type of information. That information can reside inside the file in plain text. We could use keywords or patterns. We can use regular expression to locate all kinds of, maybe it's insurance policies and provider numbers. And then we can also look at some of the metadata, like file names and sizes and ownership. But then there's another way to locate your sensitive data, and that is along behavior. So you may want to look at very high-profile groups in the organization. Maybe it's your CMO office, maybe it's your legal department, and start looking at what are those folders that these people work on a daily basis. These behaviors patterns can also point to a highly sensitive files and folders in that area as well. And really the best approach is combining these two. So as you combine content and behavior, you really get a good sense of where your sensitive data is. So let's talk about control now. Now that I know where my sensitive data resides, we should put some gatekeepers. We should get accountability and ownership on these data sets. And if we do, then we can provide some automated alerts when something happens to any of these data sets. We can automatically send an alert to these people and ask them to make decisions in real time. We can also start streamlining access requests to these when people require access to these folders. These people, when we talk about data ownership, should really come from the business side of the organization because they understand the data, they understand the impact of that data falling into the wrong hand. Now, choosing the right person is also critical. The traditional approach monitors a folder and then looks at the most active people on that folder, people who are on a daily basis, use that data in the folder that contains sensitive data. And in most cases, they just appoint the most active person to become the owner and the custodian of this data. And that could be very risky. As we all know, the most active people may not really be the authoritative source of who should be accessing this sensitive data. They may not understand the impact of that data falling into the wrong hand. So we would like to offer a more effective approach. And in that approach, yes, we should monitor the folder and understand who are the active people on that folder. But then these are the people who understand, who know what's in the folder, and these are the targeting crowd of asking. So essentially what we do, we would like to ask these people, who should be the owner? Who do you actually go to when you need access, when you're requesting access, which usually is kind of a manual process in the organization, but definitely exists there. So what we offer is a crowdsourcing process of appointing the right person. It usually points to the person who provides that information of what type of people should gain the access. If that process can be automated and facilitated, so it goes through the monitoring, the targeting, crowdsourcing, and then finally appointing the most accurate, the most chosen person, that provides the most accurate results. So let's spend one more minute on user monitoring and understand the impact of having a data owner as a gatekeeper of a folder or a data set. So we find a sensitive file that's being copied by a user. Now, this is really where we can trigger an alert to notify the owner of the file. At that point where the owner gets a notification and needs to make a decision, this is really when identity information comes in and gives the value. So understanding who's that person, what department he works in, where is he located, and who is his manager will provide the data owner that critical information at that real time to make the best decision and to finally take action, and that action should be automated immediately if that person should be removed and the access should be disabled. Now, the third point in this four-point approach is compliance. And in compliance, what we're looking to is provide proof of compliance processes in the organization, especially when we want to show controls for PHI and PII type of information, the sensitive data that is really important to us. We want to show that we streamline access reviews, maybe once a year, maybe once every 6 months. Showing that to an auditor shows that we have governance processes, that we grant access on a need-to-know basis, and during that access review, that is the opportunity for the manager or for the data owner to remove access that is no longer needed. Access based on the access that is no longer needed, and also based on access that is not being used, help us also remove some of these sensitive data sets and reduce the attack vector, reduce the overall exposure of the organization from an attack. And finally, the fourth point in this approach is remediation. And when looking at remediation, we would like to provide some intelligence to that data administrator to give him or her some points and KPIs, key risk indicators of how to eliminate some of these exposures and some of these risks by providing a list of folders that are that contain sensitive data but have no ownership, by providing a list of folders that contain sensitive data and are being overexposed by large groups in the organization. Things like activity trending that help that administrator visually identify anomalies of activities on a particular data set or a particular application that helps that person to start the forensics over a period of time that looks suspicious. And finally, we want to also automate the access fulfillment. If some of these remediation have to be taken, we want to make sure there's no error while handling these this deprovisioning activity. So Mike, I'm going to hand it over to you for summary.
Sure. Thank you, Sharon. So data is growing at this exponential rate, and focusing in on where that sensitive data is key to understanding risk. You have to know where that risk is out there. You have to be able to address it. Now, just going and looking for all that information and finding it is one thing, but having a strategic approach to understand your risk and remediate it properly is a big deal. Don't boil the ocean. Don't overwhelm yourself with too much information. Get the strategic information to effectively manage this sensitive information. And placing identity governance at the core of your program really helps get an understanding of who these individuals are, what they need to do their job, managing that access. But then when you get down to data access governance and understanding that this is the actual information that they can touch, even though it can be the wild, wild west out on places like SharePoint and file systems. And then as Sharon went through, these 4 key approaches here. Visibility, getting an understanding of what's out there, demonstrating compliance, putting the proper controls into place to manage the risk that's out there, whether it is there today or ongoing, because it changes on a day-to-day basis. And then be able to remediate to get to that least privilege model, making sure that data is in the right location, the right people have the right access to it at the right time. So I think at this point, I want to pass this over to Shay to take any questions we have from anyone out there.
Thanks, Mike. This is a friendly reminder. If you have a question, submit that in the Q&A panel, and we will address it in the time that we have left. Let's go ahead and dive in. Our first question is, can you elaborate about how data classification is used for identifying sensitive data? How is that done?
Okay. Yes. Data classification really can be divided into 2. Number 1 is things that you know that considered to be sensitive. If we think about PII and PHI type of information, we know what are our customer information that we stored or our patient information stored in our files. We also know what type of maybe these are diagnoses and codes of diseases. These are the type of things we can identify, and are, in most cases, are provided as a set of rules that is ready out of the box to identify data around HIPAA information. Second area is these are the things that you don't know. These are your intellectual property in the organization. These are things that you don't know how to find and what are those keywords that we're looking at. And in these areas, it's best to apply the behavior analysis by looking at some key people, high-profile people in the organization, and start looking at what are those data sets that they access on a daily basis, and start looking at the profile of the other people who are accessing the same files, and maybe start finding some patterns there of, high importance, sensitive data, and from there we can start eliminating access by role, by, and based on the identity information we get from people accessing.
Thank you, Sharon. Okay, next question. How do you apply access normalization on all the folders in the organization?
Well, access normalization is a practice which usually should not apply to all the folders in the organization. It should focus on the most sensitive folders. You start with the top most sensitive folders, and from there it's an iterative process of going and cleaning up the less sensitive and further down. And as you normalize the access, you try to identify who can access a particular set of sensitive data or folder, and from there apply only direct permissions to users based on their access requirements. So you don't have to deal with multiple nesting of groups and perform that analysis. This can apply to the rest of the data sets in the organization, but when it comes to more sensitive data, we would like to have normalized groups by permission levels, and when a person is put in one of these permission levels, we can ensure and we can say at that point exactly what type of access he gets.
Great, thank you. Okay, next question. What are the monitoring capabilities of the solution? What type of events, actions can you monitor?
I'll take that one. There's a couple things here. We talked a lot about the static information out there. Where is there sensitive data? Who has access to it? But monitoring is another critical key component, right? Because we're out there and we're monitoring. What does monitoring mean? Well, there's a number of things. We're monitoring permission changes. We're monitoring group policy changes. We're monitoring changes in attributes in AD. We're monitoring file activity. So someone opens a file, someone deletes a file, someone moves a file. All of that's being monitored. What's critical in the way that it's monitored is that we're doing this in real time. So all this activity is there, it's being monitored in real time, and then when there's specific things that you need to be aware of in real time, we can alert some of your assets, your SIM solution, email notification. As Sharon mentioned earlier, taking action based on some of these events that are out there.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, that wraps up our Q&A. Go ahead and keep an eye out for an email from us tomorrow. That will include a recording of today's presentation. We'll also include a complimentary solution brief titled 3 Reasons Why You May Be the Next Data Breach Target, just to elaborate on what we were discussing in today's presentation. If you'd like to learn more, contact us using the phone number or email on your screen, and we'll get you in touch with an identity expert. Mike, Sharon, thank you for your time today. Thanks for everyone who joined us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.